Hello and welcome to this presentation. It'll take about an hour to listen to, but there are places where you might want to pause the recording and do some thinking or chatting to the others in your department. We've also got some marking activities in the second half, and again, you might want to pause to allow some reading time for these activities. So today's course is aimed at those who are new to the Pearson Edexcel GCE A-level course, or for anyone who wants a refresher on what's involved. So you might be a new teacher here today, or you might be new to teaching A-level, or perhaps new to your school, or maybe you've decided to switch to the Pearson Edexcel qualification from another awarding body. Everybody's welcome, and we hope you find the session useful and informative. So this is our agenda for today, and we'll try and keep approximately to these times, but of course it does depend on how long your pauses are. So we're going to start off with an overview of the whole course, so you get a sense of what's involved. Pearson Edexcel offers different sorts of support for you, and I'll make reference to this throughout the session. So the whole home GCE programme was relaunched in 2016 following consultation with the Royal Geographical Society, the Geographical Association, many universities, teacher and other interested groups and individuals. And this led to agreement about what constitutes the core of geography at this level. And all home exam boards have to cover this core as 60% of our specification content. So this is the same for all awarding bodies. And that means that if you've taught elsewhere or used a different course, then you'll find a lot that's familiar here today. However, it might be arranged or packaged differently, so you'll need to make sure that you check the expectations of the Pearson Edexcel course. So this means that 40% of the course is non-core, and Pearson Edexcel opted to remain with our popular issues-based approach, of course making sure we keep updated with the any contemporary geographical questions. So we've opted for units on tectonics and globalization, as well as integrating extra human environment study into the carbon and water cycling topics. You'll see these in the inquiry questions on water security at a global scale and growing energy demand, for example. And the approach taken on sovereignty, identity and human rights is also a feature. So our training course today mainly covers the A-level in geography, but there are some references to AS geography as well, as the courses can be taught in parallel. A few centres do choose to do this, but most now only enter candidates for the A-level course. These first 4 topics, as you can see on the screen, tectonics, landscape systems, globalisation and shaping places, all have to be taught during the first year if you have AS candidates. But if you're not offering AS at all, you can teach these and the following 4 topics in whichever order you feel is best for your situation. We'll say a little bit more about the topics themselves in a few slides' time. So topics 5 to 8, water, carbon, superpowers, and global development and connections make up the rest of the course. And we also have the NEA, the non-examined assessment. This is a requirement for the full A-level only. The NEA is common to all awarding bodies. So this should make a switch to a new course easier for both you as a teacher, but also for your students if they have to switch schools during their A-level. And this is covered in more detail in a few slides' time. There's also a great deal of training about the NEA available on the Pearson Edexcel website, which I'll point you to later on. So the detailed spec can be found on the website and also in your pack, as well as compulsory topics on tectonics, globalization, water, carbon and superpowers. There are some decisions to be made by you and your department. Are you going to study the more often familiar coasts, or alternatively glaciation in the landscape systems topic? In shaping places, the regenerating places unit focuses more on economic change and how this alters people's perceptions of place, whereas diverse places considers the ways demographic and cultural change in places is perceived by people. The final choice is in a topic usually taught in the second year, and it's interesting here that centres are split evenly in their choice. So on the one hand, we have health, human rights and interventions. This includes a focus on inequalities at a global scale and the military and aid interventions that follow. The other option is Migration, Identity and Sovereignty, which studies the tensions between growing global interdependence and changing perceptions of national identity. So it's important to take an overview of what you need to cover in the 2 years of the A-level course. As well as the 8 topics, fieldwork and the NEA itself need to be included. Included in the pack, and you can see reference to it on the slide, is an editable course planner. If you have more than one teacher available, you'll need to decide how you'll split the course between you. Some centres enter candidates for AS to help give them exam experience or gain a qualification if they're not continuing for the second year. Others may teach overseas students, so consider the route for your centre that's most suitable. If you are going to enter candidates for AS, you will need to allow time for those people to revise and also to prepare for exam questions on fieldwork. There are what are called familiar and unfamiliar fieldwork questions on both physical and human fieldwork. If you have a look in the pack, you'll see the 2019 AS papers, mark schemes and examiners reports to see examples of these. Of course, the COVID pandemic is likely to alter options for fieldwork, so do please check the latest information from Ofqual and the Pearson website for this. You'll also have college and school rules to abide by as well, and there are no right answers here, so it is important to think through the options before you start, and hopefully that will be helpful. You might want to pause the commentary here for a moment to briefly consider or discuss the questions on the slide. To help you find your way through the specification, here is the first section, so you can see what it looks like. Each section should take about 2 hours lesson time to teach, plus some research time for your students. However, some are fuller than others, and you may find you want to combine detailed content or teach some ideas in a slightly different order. Exam questions may be based either on key ideas or the detailed content in the right-hand column. These spec summaries of what should be taught are brief, and Pearson Edexcel has provided schemes of work and topic booklets on the website. These documents cover the whole of the specification and are designed to refresh your knowledge, as well as give you some suggested teaching approaches and lesson ideas with activities and assignments for your students. These are available on the website from the link given here. The next section provides some guidance when planning for your teaching. So I'm going to highlight a few key areas that you need to bear in mind as you plan your course, and we'll take each of these 4 ideas in turn. So first up, geographical skills. Of course, as geographers, we need to use a range of skills to help equip us to study our subject in depth, and the basics of these will have been taught from early on in a student's education, though some of these will need a refresher before going on to acquire the standard required for A-level. An overview can be found at the end of the content part of the specification on pages 91 to 92, and many will be ones you've already covered if you're moving from a different awarding body. Some teachers and students may find the maths and statistics skills required quite a challenge, so Pearson Edexcel have provided a guide to help you. You'll also find this in the pack alongside the presentation, and there's a link on the slide. There's also help from the Field Studies Council on skills generally, and the link at the bottom of the slide takes you to a guide about appropriate use of statistics for data analysis linked to the NEA, for example. Next up, we're going to look at how we integrate skills into the specification. So these skills are integrated into the study of particular topics, and suggestions are made as to where they are appropriate. The skills are indicated by a number in brackets, as you can see highlighted on the slide in the detailed content. And then at the end of that section of the specification, there's a full list of the skills required. So here we're looking at topic 7.1, superpowers. As a particular skill about creating a power index indicated here. So it might be a good idea here to pause and have a quick look at the skills listed in the specification. And and identify which areas you think you might need support to deliver. There's a few questions here to guide your thinking. You might be really confident and therefore able to help another member of the department, or maybe you're feeling concerned about your abilities. Perhaps you could talk to someone in your maths department at your centre who could help you with any gaps in your knowledge. It's also worth remembering that biology, psychology and sociology teachers may well use some of the same statistical techniques, and they may be confident at teaching them to non-mathematicians, so they could also be a useful source to talk to. And of course, a reminder of the Maths for Geographers guide, which we mentioned a couple of slides ago. Okay, now to something distinctly geographical. Geography requires the study of places, and though there are no required case studies in this specification, there are place contexts suggested throughout, and each of these is indicated with a globe symbol. What that means is that students need to name an example for each of these. So there are specific examples included in the specification, but these are just suggestions, and you could choose similar suitable contexts instead if you wish. It's useful to try and audit the case studies so that they reinforce one another, and to try to avoid too many different examples for students. In particular, given that this is an issues-based specification, choosing content that helps to reinforce an understanding of those issues is hugely beneficial, as well as interesting for candidates. An example can be offered here. The Eyjafjallajökull eruption was unusual, both in its magnitude and in its global impact for an eruption of a volcano on a constructive margin. It's useful to help qualify the cliché about explosivity and the subsequent impact that's offered by so many students. Two important places that you will need to select carefully are your local and contrasting places that are required for topic 4. Candidates should study the place near where they study or live, and the idea being that they will have considerable knowledge about this place already. As travel away from school or college has become even more difficult during COVID times, it's even more important to be able to study a place nearby in depth. This may become a location for candidates to use for their NEA as well, and there's much further support about this on the website. There are some important issues here. Firstly, the use of variable scales. This has been seen in exam answers where like was often not compared with like. For example, a village as a local place contrasted with a city, or a single ward or lower super output area, LSOA, contrasted with a whole county. So for these places, working at a small local scale is important for manageability. For example, the use of a few lower super output areas within a town or part of a borough within a city, or else a small town or village. That's plenty to go into the depth required. We would suggest that you use the Index of Multiple Deprivation data, the IMD, from their website rather than ONS data or ward level data available from local authorities' websites. The links on the slide provide some really useful and highly recommended sources, and most of these work from postcodes. We've got an example of this on the next slide. So here we have an example of maps from the Index of Multiple Deprivation website. They show marked contrast within short distances, both in Kensington, London, as well as Truro in Cornwall. So students might be able to visit two such places quite easily, and therefore be able to gain a real understanding of how and why the two places have developed so differently. So here is another chance for you to pause the recording and reflect on the questions on the slide. Where could you choose? How could you get to the two places? And one point of caution if you're considering using a place where some students live is think carefully about how they might feel if others judge and comment about that place negatively. So the synoptic themes at the top of this table: players, attitudes and actions, and features and uncertainties are designed to support you in teaching and understanding of geographical issues, and especially to help inform the understanding that almost all decisions are disputed. So students are required to answer 2 synoptic questions at AS. These are 16-mark extended writing questions in both the human and physical papers. and all of the core topics, that's topics 1, 3, 5, 6 and 7, or tectonics, globalization, carbon, water and superpowers. All of these topics are significant and will be significant in some of the Unit 3 questions at A-level, given that there is no optionality in their delivery. So examples of the way these themes are explored in topics 1 to 4 are given here. So if you read through this slide, you might want to pause it and come back to it later, or come back to it later. You'll see how each of the themes relate to each of the particular topics. And here are the synoptic themes detailed for topics 5 to 8. Again, there's a lot to read here, so you might want to pause it or come back to it later on. So here we have an example of part of a Paper 3 resource booklet to illustrate how location is used to provide a synoptic study. Although neither the questions nor the resource booklet will necessarily use the terms players, attitudes and actions and futures uncertainties, there's an expectation that candidates understand these terms and are able to discuss the different perspectives that they produce. The final special consideration you need to make as you plan your teaching is the crucial matter of fieldwork. As the first bullet point states, completion of fieldwork is compulsory, and centres have to submit a fieldwork statement each year to say when they completed 4 days and what they did on each occasion. At AS, candidates will still be required to answer questions on their own fieldwork, called familiar, and also on unfamiliar topics. There's guidance in the AS specification on pages 12 and 13 about questions that students could investigate through fieldwork, both in landscape systems and shaping places. So please see the website for further updates about this. A-level students might also benefit from doing fieldwork on carbon and water topics. Please note that data collection for the NEA can count towards the 4-day requirement. It's important that students have the chance to develop a range of fieldwork skills to help them plan and carry out their own individual investigations. The independent investigation is an important part of the A-level course, and it's common to all awarding bodies. It contributes 20% of the overall marks for the A-level. Students must follow the route to inquiry process to plan and carry out, as well as write up this themselves. And they are only allowed minimal support from staff. Guidance as to what support is allowed can be found at the end of the specification document. The pieces of work are then marked by the centre and moderated by the exam board. So the next part of our training covers the way the course is assessed, and in particular the structure of the exam papers. First up, assessment structure and principles. The assessment structure is straightforward in that it is predictable. There are 3 or more sections in each exam paper, and within each section, the mark allocation and the demand of these questions increase. So questions start off with more simple, straightforward, short answer questions, and then the final part of each section is an essay requiring extended writing. This requires candidates to assess for 12 marks or evaluate for 20 marks in papers 1 and 2, and for 18 and 24 marks in paper 3. The command words and assessment objectives will remain the same in every exam for the life of the specification, so this gives candidates and teachers confidence that they know what will be expected in each paper. The independent investigation assesses in a different way, and in particular helps to prepare students for university level study by requiring them to research a topic of their choice, collecting data, analysing and concluding coherently and with evaluation. So these assessment objectives here speak for themselves, but it's worth noting that they are slightly different to those used at GCSE. There is a balance required in the assessment objectives required for the various different types of questions, and these are very precisely allocated, as you'll see later. They won't change for the lifetime of the specification. So in other words, section A of paper 1 will always be made up of a 4-mark quantitative question and a 12-mark extended writing question. That's on tectonics. There'll be no surprises there. It's important that students recognise where they need to satisfy more than one of these assessment objectives in their answers. So, for example, a 12-mark question, an assessed question that is, has 4 AO1 marks available and 8 AO2 marks. So knowledge and understanding of the specification content, that's AO1, is required, but also, and more importantly, because it's worth 8 marks, students need to be applying that knowledge and understanding to the question being asked and able to make a judgment about the significance of the factors identified in the answer. Internal marking should get students into the habit of being able to see where they are not addressing these AOs in their answers. So we are bound by Ofqual's assessment objectives across the qualification, and we need to achieve the weightings of their assessment objectives overall. Papers will always follow the same model as established in both the sample assessment materials, the specimen papers, and the 2018 and 2019 live papers. So you have a few examples already available to look at, and the autumn 2020 papers will also be available in due course. Please note that papers 1 and 2 do mirror each other in their mark allocations, but paper 3 and the NEA have significantly more AO3 in them. We're going to discuss the command words in a moment. The same assessment objectives are used at AS as at A level, but there are slightly different types of questions. The papers all include short open response calculation and resource questions, and 6, 12 and 16 mark extended writing questions at AS level. There may also be a couple of multiple choice questions. There are compulsory fieldwork questions, and both papers 1 and 2 are mirror images of each other. Please see the examiner's reports for more details on what to expect, and you can also find the 2019 sets of AS papers in your pack. At A level, papers 1 and 2 also include short open response, calculation and resource questions, as well as 6, 8, 12 and 20 mark extended writing questions. Here, papers 1 and 2 are not quite mirror images of each other, and there are 2 topics with options on paper 2, whereas there's only 1 with options on paper 1. So candidates do need to be trained in what to expect. Looking at the sample assessment materials, past papers and examiners' reports will help you and students gain familiarity with the papers, and the 2019 sets of papers can be found in the pack. Paper 3 and the independent investigation are detailed here on this slide. Paper 3, you'll note, does include reading time for the detailed resource booklet, which gives information about geographical issues in a particular place. So you'll notice that all 3 exam papers are 2 hours and 15 minutes, but this one's only worth 70 marks, whereas papers 1 and 2 have 105 marks allocated. So far, we've used the Congo, Singapore, Japan, and Southeast Asia as the locations for the issues. It's worth noting that there's no pre-release for this paper as well. Paper 3 is also the only paper to use the command word analyze, and there are 2 longer extended writing questions that are worth 18 and 24 marks respectively. Our independent investigation is similar to other awarding bodies, but do note that there are 70 marks to be scored here, whilst other awarding bodies have 60. But there is a common approach and expectation, so those who are transferring to Pearson Edexcel will find much that is similar. So here we have the common command words used at both AS and A level. Note that the expectations for the command words are consistent at both levels. However, there are variations in mark tariffs for assess and evaluate questions for AS and A level for different command words. Candidates should be taught what's expected for each of these command words, and then the words should be used consistently in classwork and centre assessments. We are going to look at some examples of the different styles of questions shortly. This table is useful and shows the assessment objective breakdown for the command words and their questions split into AS and A level. By referring to this and to the assessment objective slide, that's slide 25, centres should be able to understand what's expected in an answer to a specific command word. So, for example, in the synoptic paper 3, an evaluate question expects candidates to show accurate and relevant knowledge and understanding from what they've been taught in the classroom. So that's the AO1 marks. You can see worth 3 or 4 in the table. They also need to demonstrate the ability to interpret the information in the resource booklet and find logical and relevant connections and relationships between the different sets of data. That's AO2. And they need to be able to make valid judgments about the value and reliability of the data in the resource booklet. So AO3 marks as well. So to summarise, it's really important that both you as teachers and your candidates have a good understanding of the assessment objectives and the way that they're used in the exam papers. The consistent use of command words will be a real help to you here, as well as the fact that the exam papers will always be designed in the same way, with the same number of extended writing questions. So next we are going to look at all of this in practice by looking at some examples of each command word in the exam papers. The format here is in the context of questions from the 2019 papers. The way the mark scheme works is explained, and then a candidate's work or an extract from it is provided alongside a commentary about that script. Samples are taken from the different options, so you might find that some are not relevant to your centre's choices. Here it's up to you. Either fast forward over these sections and skip the slides, or listen anyway. The general principles apply to all topics and to AS as well, as the command words and assessment objectives are the same. There are no samples today from AS papers, but they are all provided in the pack with the examiner's reports. After a few explanations and examples, you'll be given the chance to mark some examples on your own, with comments and the agreed mark to follow to help check that you're along the right lines. We're going to start off with the smaller tariff questions and work up to the longer ones. There'll be a few observations to make about the layout of questions and other matters on some of these questions, and examples are chosen from papers 1, 2 and 3 from 2019. The full papers, mark schemes and examiner's reports are available in the pack. Some of the font sizes on the slides are really quite small, so you may want to have the examiner's reports or mark schemes open on another tab to help you read them. The relevant page number you need are provided on the PowerPoint slide where necessary. The lowest tariff question at A-level are 3 mark questions. There are some 1 or 2 mark calculation questions, but these are not covered here today. Remember that there is the maths guide available for more details, and you can also look at the individual exam papers, mark schemes and examiner's reports. All the sample assessment materials, specimen papers and 2018 sets are to be found on the website if you want some additional examples. So looking at this question, it starts with a statement to study a particular figure in the resource booklet. This will be a separate document for them in the exam, but electronically you usually find it at the end of the question paper as part of the same document. It's essential that candidates follow these instructions and they must refer to the resource in their answer. This question has a line graph which shows a fairly simple trend, and the candidate is asked to explain the impact of the changes. These questions have an AO1, AO2 split, and 1 mark is reserved for analysing the resource. Here the mark scheme requires the candidate to identify the increase in biofuel production, and then further marks are earned by expanding a comment about what impact this would have on the carbon cycle. Note that only 1 impact can be credited, so having suggested an impact, the candidate then needs to be able to develop the point further in order to get the full marks available. So for example, some candidates suggested that increased biofuel use would lead to increased carbon in the atmosphere because less carbon would be sequestered by the biofuel species than the tropical rainforest, which had been removed. So an example of an impact and development. So take a moment to read the candidate's answer here. You might want to pause the recording here and on subsequent slides to give yourself time to read. The original is found on page 31 of the examiner's report for paper 1. So as stated in the commentary, 3 marks have been awarded here for making a point using the data and then for explaining the impact on an aspect of the carbon cycle. So next up, we're going to have a look at a 4-mark explain question. This type of explain question is found on all 3 papers and it never has a resource. And again, the word 1, which is in bold, is important for this paper 3 question here looking at. So the candidate is asked to explain how one theory of development can help an understanding of global patterns of power. So multiple theories here would not be allowed in the mark scheme. The candidate must stick with one theory and build a developed answer from that one theory. So the mark scheme for these short questions tends to give about 3 examples of routes that candidates might take to answer the question, but it is important to remember that other routes or theories will be allowed if appropriate. You might want to pause this to have a more detailed read of the mark scheme. So here we have an example answer. The candidate, as you can see, has selected a relevant theory here, the world systems theory. It is worth pointing out that there is no mark for simply identifying a theory. The candidate has to go on to say something about it and how it helps understand global patterns of power to score the mark. Here, the candidate has used trade and aid to explain the dependency that exists between core, semi-periphery and periphery countries. The commentary here explains these ideas more fully, so you may want to pause to have a read through of this in more detail. But you can see the awarded 4 marks for this answer. Papers 1 and 2 at both AS and A level have 6-mark questions. There are questions with a resource, as shown in the next set of slides, and also 6-mark questions without a resource. There'll usually be 2 ideas or themes. Here there are regeneration and living environments are linked together by connecting words, which direct the candidate to an explanation. Here they're explaining about whether regeneration usually improves people's living environment or not. In order to score full marks, all aspects of the question needs to be explored. So here, with an extended writing question, we've got a levels-based mark scheme, and all levels-based mark scheme for extended writing questions are laid out like this, which starts with marking instructions, and then we have indicative content guidance, and then the levels-based mark scheme itself. The main points to note are these. The notes that follow beneath this preamble on this slide are for guidance. So it's recognised that candidates may offer other acceptable answers. Answers are not marked point by point. 6-mark answers do not require 6 points. Rather, the levels are used to guide markers into the best fit for an answer. This is the indicative content section, which suggests for the examiner possible specification content that the candidate might be expected to draw on to answer the question. Here, for example, the mark scheme details how living environments might be improved through cleaning up polluted derelict areas, thus altering perceptions of a local place. There's no requirement here to use examples, but it is recommended as it helps candidates root their answer in a place they've studied and consider how regeneration has altered a place, as well as the ways in which people have benefited from this. The third part of the mark scheme is what we call the levels-based mark scheme. So here we have 3 levels which are used by an examiner to judge the candidate's answer by the criteria detailed in the descriptors. You'll notice that there's similar language in each of the levels, and here the geographical knowledge and understanding and the range of geographical ideas are judged. Higher tariff questions have 4 levels, as we'll see shortly. Examiners have to decide whether the knowledge and understanding in the answer has some inaccurate or irrelevant elements, or if it's mostly relevant but has some inaccuracies, or if it's accurate and relevant all the way through. The range of ideas is just narrow and lacking detail, or not fully detailed, or at the top level broad, detailed and fully developed. So here you might want to pause in order to read the candidate's answer through, and you might also need to make the screen larger to see this answer. You can also find the answer in the Paper 2 Examiner's Report in the pack on page 21. I've tried to use samples with legible handwriting, but I do appreciate that this is in the eye of the beholder. So you might want to pause now to give yourself a chance to read this. So here, if we look at this answer, the first sentence does go beyond repeating the question. It uses the word attractive, showing that the focus is going to be on the people and their perception of the place. In general, we wouldn't recommend repeating the question as it wastes time and rarely begins to provide an answer which scores marks. However, many candidates like to start this way, and it can help settle the mind and help with the processing of an answer. So full comments and reasons for the full marks awarded here are given, with the comments showing how the levels-based mark scheme's requirements for level 3 have been met. Note the comment about using a candidate's local and contrasting places where appropriate. Again, you might want to pause here to read this through. So some 6 mark questions have a resource, and these are found on papers 1 and 2, as well as in the AS papers 1 and 2. The assessment objective is split, with 3 marks for AO1, that's knowledge and understanding, and 3 marks for AO2, interpretation from the resource being applied to the question set. We don't award separate marks for each assessment objective at AS or A level, but in order to score level 3, both aspects should be included. Here the candidate is expected to apply their knowledge of coastal deposition to the image shown. So again, we have indicative content from the mark scheme showing the AO1 knowledge that the candidate should have learned, as well as the AO2 interpretation and relationships or connections that the candidate might be expected to find between the resource and the question. Again, you might want to pause here to read this through, or you can find it in the paper 1 mark scheme on page 19. The levels-based mark scheme shows the differences clearly between an answer that only requires AO1 knowledge and understanding, as seen on slide 45, and one that needs AO2 as well. As before, in order to achieve level 3, a candidate does need accurate and relevant knowledge and understanding throughout the answer. They also need to find and explain or write about fully relevant connections and relationships between the image of the coastal plain and the question about the contribution of coastal deposition to the development of the landscape. Pause the recording now and read this answer through. You'll also find it on page 21 of the Examiner's Report for paper 1. What level would you place this short essay in, and what are your reasons for this? The commentary here explains that this answer demonstrates accurate and relevant geographical knowledge and understanding of how deposition may have contributed to the development of this landscape, so it was placed in level 3. It applies knowledge and understanding to geographical information logically to find fully relevant connections and relationships between the photo and the question. It has a range of ideas which are accurate and relevant, including beach formation, as well as details on wave type and succession, with a focus on the development of the landscape. Therefore, it was awarded 6 marks. Explain questions for 8 marks never have a resource. On paper 3, the 8-mark analyse questions do have a resource, however, and an example of this follows this group of slides. Here is the indicative content for this question. A sample of different countries' governments' approach to human rights is provided, and a candidate would not be expected to use all of these, of course. The 8-mark level-based mark scheme still has 3 levels and is identical to the wording of the 6-mark A01 mark scheme. The questions here are broader in scope, and this level 3 answer would need to cover several different types of government in their answer, each one focused on a different reason for their approach to human rights. So here is the example answer, and the writing here is rather small, so please do remember to use the examiner's report in the documents in the pack to make it easier to read. You might want to pause the recording here. Seven marks are scored here. There's rather a lot of history and background to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it takes a while before marks begin to be scored. Then there's a discussion of whether human rights apply in time of war, and then some discussion which isn't fully clear about why some governments did not sign up to the UDHR. Type of government is identified as a reason. Definitions vary with reference to China and India. A few human rights are briefly mentioned here: right to life and liberty and freedom of expression and belief, but they're not fully explained or linked to the reasons given. For a higher level 3 mark, they'd need more detail on the rights, and the reasons why they are either upheld or not would be required. It can be noted that there's not time in an exam to write down everything that you've learned about a topic. It's important to be selective and show the examiner your understanding of the relevant aspects only. Descriptive answers at A-level will only score low marks. So moving on, earlier we mentioned that paper 3 has 2 analysed 8-mark questions which are based on resources. So see the resource booklet for paper 3 for a clearer version of figures 1 and 2. I've got the page numbers on the slides. Note that the text between figure 2 is also part of figure 2. Candidates will gain relevant ideas from reading this text to help them answer the question, so it's really important that they don't ignore that text. So here is the mark scheme, and again, a larger version of this can be found in the mark scheme for paper 3 in the pack. Although not always the case, analysed questions may draw on 2 or more resources. In 2019, which is the paper we're looking at here, these were maps, and some candidates did struggle to interpret the 2 figures. They needed to identify a pattern of earthquake concentration for some AO3 marks in figure 2, and then make the connection to landforms such as trenches and arcs in figure 1. For level 3 in an analysed question, as well as showing accurate knowledge throughout the answer, candidates need to critically investigate the question to produce a coherent analysis with relevant connections. For example, lengthy description of the evidence is not needed, and here analysis could be about patterns of the depth or the magnitude of earthquakes, and could either consider a trend or observe an anomaly that's outside the main pattern. AO1 knowledge about volcanic arcs and trenches would help a candidate interpret what they have observed. So here is a sample for you to read through and then decide what level and mark you think the candidate should be awarded. What do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of this answer? Pause the recording whilst you read and consider this. And again, remember that you can find it in the examiner's report in the pack on page 12 and 13 if you need to. The answer here illustrates a key element in the assessment process, the philosophy of positive marking. So most of the material on the right-hand side of slide 60 is irrelevant to this question, although it would have worked quite well as a summary to an answer to question 4 on the paper. So obviously that is a weakness of the answer. However, what comes before is a real strength. The candidate engages with the resources and makes comments about the relationship between plate boundaries and the distribution of earthquakes. Not all of it is correct, but the inferences are plausible and therefore rewardable, and they are showing that they're bringing their own understanding of tectonics, A01, to the answer. For example, the reference to different earthquake waves. Overall, this response gained 7 marks. Candidates can't lose marks, so if in doubt, do encourage them to include a point that they're not certain of. On to 12-mark essay questions, which are a bedrock of this specification at AS and A-level. Candidates will have to write 4 12-mark essays for both the AS and A-level exams, and some will have a resource. It's therefore vital that they are confident over what to expect and that they understand the way the mark scheme and the assessment objectives work here. 4 marks are available for A01 and 8 marks for A02, but they are not allocated separately within the level-based mark scheme. Instead, as with the 6-mark questions, candidates need to show knowledge and understanding and apply this to the question to produce a full and coherent interpretation which is supported by evidence. This is an example of a 12-mark essay question which doesn't have a resource, but the same mark scheme will be used for a question with a resource. So here we have a globalization question to assess the methods used in local communities to reduce the impact of globalization on the environment. So again, here we have the mark scheme with indicative content. The A01 content expected would include local scale examples about transition towns, local organic sourcing, or protests about climate change, or actions of TNCs both in the UK or elsewhere. To achieve an upper level 2 or level 3 answer, A02 interpretation and assessment is required, and candidates need to consider the negative impacts of globalization that these methods were designed to reduce and assess how effective the measures were. The levels-based mark scheme for 12-mark questions has 3 levels, and here each is worth 4 marks. For a top-level answer, we're looking for a full and coherent interpretation and a fully supported argument that comes to a judgment. So here we have our example answer, and again you might want to take time to pause and read and consider what level and mark would you award here and what are your reasons. Again, you can access this in the Paper 2 Examiner's Report in your pack on page 7 and 8. As the commentary states, the candidate examines methods linking each to a specific environmental impact caused by globalization. Comparative points are made about the relative value of the different methods. For full marks, an overall judgment about how far methods like these can counter the environmental impacts of globalization would be useful, and this answer does not do this. 11 marks were awarded. If a candidate makes their judgment clear from the start, this can help structure their argument and make an essay more coherent, enabling them to make relevant connections to the essay title throughout. Separate paragraphs for each new method or impact would have improved the structure here as well. "20-mark evaluate questions use the command word evaluate, which is also used for the 16-mark questions on AS. At AS, these questions always have a resource, but at A-level, they may or may not have a resource. This question came from Paper 1 in 2019. The indicative content and levels-based mark scheme can be found in the mark scheme in the pack. We do realise that relatively few centres choose glaciation, but this presentation is trying to cover as much of the specification as possible, hence looking at a glaciation question, and the general principles discussed here still apply to coasts. The indicative content and levels-based mark scheme are found in full in the mark scheme on the pages shown on the slide, but we've got brief extracts of each given here for you to have a look at. So again, here we'll look at an extract from the introduction and conclusion of an answer, and the rest can be found in the examiner's report on pages 16 and 17. Please pause and read and decide on a level and a mark. This is a good example of an answer that reaches level 4 because it meets some of the criteria, with good support for a range of relevant ideas, and it comes to a conclusion. However, there are gaps in the knowledge and understanding needed, which restricts the score to 17 marks. The use of resources is key to success on paper 3. The final 2 evaluate questions on this paper score 18 and 24 marks respectively, and they'll expect the candidate to draw on ideas gained from the whole booklet. They should interpret these in the light of all their studies across their 2 years of A-level geography. Here they will need to reflect on their work on superpowers and globalization, as well as the carbon and water topics, alongside the resource booklet itself. The mark scheme, as you can see, provides comprehensive ideas on possible routes to answering the question, and there's certainly no expectation a candidate would include all of this information. Again, it's quite small, so you can see this if you look in the mark scheme in the pack on pages 16 to 18. We've taken just a sample of an answer here, and the whole answer can be found in the examiner's report. So here you can see the introduction on this slide and the conclusion on the next slide. It's clear that planning has gone into these, and that's key to ensuring that a strong structured answer is achieved. So this shows part of the conclusion from the same candidate. The final 24-mark question in paper 3 should identify relevant aspects to the debate in the question and weigh the evidence and come to a conclusion. Exaggerated sweeping statements are not helpful, nor is setting out 2 sides of the argument, as there will usually be several. Looking at possible changes in the future can be helpful, as could be evaluating the level of flexibility and potential to respond to changed circumstances. So next up, we're going to have a brief look at the non-examined assessment, or NEA, also known as the individual investigation. The NEA is clearly a vital part of the A-level. The candidates often find satisfaction and pride in completing it, and we're not going to do a lengthy review of it here, but it is worth pointing out that there's a great deal of other training provided by Pearson Edexcel, as well as support from the Royal Geographical Society, the Geographical Association, the Field Studies Council, and many other providers too. The format of the NEA is common to all exam boards, following the same route to inquiry as is shown here. This builds on work you may have done yourself at school or university, but do take a special care to check the mark scheme used by Pearson Edexcel, as each exam board has their own version. Post-COVID, collection of primary data might be different to previous years, and Pearson Edexcel has produced a special set of support materials available on the website. These encourage centres to consider a wider range of data collection methods using technology and social media, and seek to explore human geography topics in particular in new ways. A series of 4 separate 1-hour recordings with PowerPoints are being produced over the summer in 2020 to help candidates and centres understand what's required, especially as most had restricted access to fieldwork trips. These can be found in the pre-recorded training pages on the website, and there's a link on the slide. So finally, to support. Pearson Edexcel provides a great deal of support for its centres, and we'll just run through some of that support over the next few slides. So first up, Results Plus is a widely used and very popular. It helps to diagnose where candidates' strengths and weaknesses are, showing which parts of the specification and also the types of questions where your candidates are doing well and where they need more support. On the right-hand side, Exam Wizard is mentioned, and this is a giant question bank, and it makes it really easy to design your own mock papers, assignments, and homework using past questions, and helps to build mark schemes and examiners' reports, as well as question papers in a really smart format. As mentioned previously, there are planning documents, schemes of work and top-lit booklets on each part of the specification, so do click on the links to explore these. The mapping document will help you to see how other awarding body specifications overlap and show you places where Pearson Edexcel takes a different approach. Sally Dodsley, that you can see on the slide, is the subject advisor for geography, so do sign up for her emails. You can also use the Ask the Expert service for questions that you can't find the answer to elsewhere, and contact Sally if you need to use this, and there are a few useful links on the slide. Pearson endorses these 3 textbooks. There's 3 for Year 1 and 3 for Year 2. But there are also numerous other resources available. Facebook and Twitter offer comments and ideas, and there are a growing number of YouTube channels and other websites such as Schoology, Seneca, Time for Geography, Cool Geography, along with many, many others. As outlined here, we want to help your students achieve their potential, and we want to produce high quality resources, but you don't need to pay for resources to teach Pearson Edexcel courses. Thank you for listening. We hope that this has been useful. Don't forget to check through the slides and click on any resources that you might find useful.